Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. Today, the forgotten crisis. Here on Zero, we've dedicated a lot of time covering COP29 at the end of last year. In Baku, we interviewed the heads of state, the CEO of ExxonMobil, and even the COP30 president, who by that time hadn't been named as such. But there was another COP last year, COP16, that focused on biodiversity in Cali, Colombia, where nations came together to try to figure out how to protect natural habitats, plant, animal species, and halt the destruction of nature. If the climate crisis is a monster wave, the biodiversity crisis could be a leviathan. And unlike COP29, actually, COP16 is still not over. It ended before key agreements could be reached, and so talks are going to resume next week in Rome. I wasn't at COP16, but my colleague, Natasha White, was.
Hi, Akshat. I was indeed, and thanks for having me today.
We're going to talk a lot more about why these talks dragged on and what will happen in Rome. But Natasha, tell me first, how was Cali?
Cali, so it's the capital of sugarcane in Colombia. It's sort of nestled between mountains and the sea, and it's also known to be the capital of salsa dance, not the salsa sauce. And it's a really vibrant town, and this came through, I think, to a great extent in the way that Colombia hosted the COP. It was really framed as the People's COP, and the green zone, so the area. At these COPs, you have a blue zone where all the official proceedings take place and you need to have official access and it's much more managed. But then you also have a green zone where anyone can exhibit and the general public can visit. And in Cali, the green zone and the blue zone were apart. So the green zone was downtown. It was kind of in the center of the city. It had a sort of street festival vibe. It was open from the morning to late at night, and there were live music events. There was salsa. Unfortunately, I didn't make any of it, although that's probably no bad thing given I can't dance. But it was, a really vibrant, warm place to host it. And the COP itself was kind of nestled out of town in the foothills of some hills. So you had beautiful mountain backdrop to the conference venue. And beautiful nature all around.
Well, you clearly got the better assignment here at Bloomberg because you also came to Baku and that place had no natural daylight, let alone all the beautiful mountains.
Yeah, it's true. In Baku, we kind of walked into a tent in a stadium. There was no natural light. There was no fresh air. There was nowhere to stand outside and get some daylight. In Cali, the tents were all separated. It was hot. It was sunny. You know, there was water features. It was just a much more kind of humane setting for a COP. There was an explicit choice, I think, to host the COP in this city because of its nature, and you really feel it surrounds you. You know, we went out for dinner one night in the old town, and we were sort of taken over by a cacophony of frogs while we were eating.
Well, that's loud. I mean, frogs I like, but I don't like the croaking. This sounds actually quite pleasant. Well, it seems like you had way more fun than we did at COP29. But biodiversity COPs in general now have started to become bigger and are being given perhaps not as much importance as climate COPs, but increasing importance. And what happened at COP15 in Montreal perhaps made that happen because it was this big moment where 190 nations reached an agreement to preserve 30% of the planet's land and seas. Having that big goal set was important, but really just to understand what is at stake with biodiversity.
Well, I think if you start with the numbers, WWF does analysis which has shown that over the past 5 decades, over the past 50 years, the diversity of species has declined by, I think, around 75%, which is massive. So that's the numbers. I think everybody feels it. Like, you know, in this country, in the UK, where we're both based, people commonly talk about the number of insects on their windscreens when they drive around in the summer. And even I am in my mid-30s. Like when I was younger, I grew up in the countryside. It was something I remember regularly, not being able to wash the windscreen well enough to see where you're going. And now it's just not the case. Over the summer we had the windows open and the lights on, and normally there'd be insects buzzing around them, but there are none. So everybody recognises this drastic loss in biodiversity, and this country, the UK, is one of the worst, but it's affecting every country in the world. And that's what this global biodiversity framework that was agreed in Montreal in 2022 seeks to address. And so the kind of overarching goal of that, which is for 2050, is for the world to be living in harmony with nature. But underneath these broad goals, there's a number of, I think, around 23 targets, which are a lot more specific. One of them is the protect 30% of land and sea, well, land and water actually, by 2030. And so countries gathered in COP this year to look at the progress that they've made since that framework was agreed.
And even at this COP in biodiversity, finance was at the heart of the conversation. But what was the approach to try and raise money towards what clearly is a very important issue, not just from a perspective of how humans should live on the planet, but also from the perspective of how do we sustain an economy where humans thrive, because nature is so important to enable that to happen?
Yeah, so on the money, there's a $700 billion per year financing gap that's been identified for tackling this problem. And that's kind of split into two buckets. One, which covers around 500 billion, is about redirecting harmful subsidies. So the money that governments pay to make cheaper things that destroy nature. So fossil fuel production, chemical agriculture, things like this. And the goal there is to redirect those subsidies from doing harm to things that do good. So regenerative agriculture, or what's being called the bioeconomy, basically business that doesn't harm the planet. And then the other is the remaining 200 billion is what needs to be raised in kind of new money from all sources, public and private. And that's where we see a lot of the kind of parallels in the climate space, I think, where it's about getting more grant money from governments, more concessional finance from governments and multilateral development banks, and more private sector money invested in, again, things that aren't harming nature, but instead are sensitive to it.
In the climate sphere, I think there is now a certain sense that has settled, and I'm not saying it's widely accepted and always consistent, but the fact that cleaner energy is cheaper than fossil fuels, that investing in clean energy is actually going to not just have an impact on carbon, but so many other things. That old canard that, the only way progress or economic progress could happen is through extraction, through perhaps some amount of harm to the environment, has been in some ways been broken in the climate sphere. Do you think that's been broken in the biodiversity sphere? Do you think people understand that it is actually possible to have economic activity that does not harm nature?
Well, I think the challenge of biodiversity and sort of nature loss more broadly is it's extremely cross-cutting, right? In some areas, I would say it's even more fundamental in the biodiversity space. If you look at agriculture, I think agriculture companies are not going to make any money unless they change their business model. So in that space, it makes perfect business sense to manage the land in a way that nurtures nature so that nature can give back, in terms of production. In other areas, it's more challenging, I think, because the business model that we're all used to is externalizing the negativities. We dump waste, we don't really recycle it or limit its production. And it's those business models where it's cheapest to behave in that way are the ones that really need to fundamentally change. And that's structural, and it's hard, and it's not just about moving subsidies, but overhauling an entire way of functioning, which is a big challenge.
And so at this COP16, what were the headline things on the agenda? And we know from headlines, from stories you've written, that largely it ended in failure. But let's just first go through what were things on the agenda and understand why it was classed as a failure.
What was on the agenda at the outset, which we identified as the most important, one was a stock take. So countries have to submit national biodiversity plans for how they are going to achieve the targets and the goals of the global biodiversity framework. And the deadline for doing so was the beginning of COP. So by that measure, very few countries managed to submit their MBSAPs on time. Some gave reasons for that, which was that they really want to engage, for example, Indigenous peoples and local communities in defining these kind of cross-cutting strategies, and that takes time and it's not easy. But nonetheless, they've had 2 years to do it, and a lot of them, most of them, failed. So by that measure, it wasn't a great success. The second big agenda item was a strategy, a resource mobilization strategy. So a way to raise this $200 billion per year from public and private sources to tackle nature loss. The third main agenda item was finding a way to collect and share the profits from companies that benefit from what's called digital sequence information on genetic resources. And it's extremely technical, but in essence, what it's about is pharmaceutical companies, cosmetics companies, biotech companies, all of them make money out of products that are based on nature's genetics. And that used to be a physical process. But in the day and age that we live in today, obviously a lot of that has become digitized. Yeah, so it's difficult for the countries that are home to this diversity to benefit from it. So, for example, the venom of a lizard found in Mexico and the US inspired the blockbuster drug Ozempic for weight loss and diabetes. Well, Mexico may well not have been remunerated for the benefits that companies have accumulated thanks to its biological genetic diversity. So the idea of this mechanism is to find a way to collect a portion of the profits or of the revenue of these big pharmaceutical biotech companies and share them with the countries from which these resources come. It's not a kind of direct trade, but the idea is there'll be a kind of levy of 1% of profits or 0.1% of revenue that will go into a fund, and then that fund will distribute money to countries that are rich in biodiversity to help protect biodiversity. And those were the kinds of details actually that were ironed out during the COP. And throughout the 2 weeks, negotiators worked on this text, which one of a veteran negotiator described to me as the most complex item he's ever negotiated in his life. He kind of likened it to quantum physics. And you can imagine when you're talking about a voluntary mechanism to levy certain sectors globally through a United Nations mechanism to sort of centralize money and distribute it. There's a number of questions there that are extremely difficult to iron out, and some were ironed out and some weren't. But that was a big focus of the event.
So usually these COP meetings come toward an end with all these countries negotiating and ideally coming to a consensus that signs off on some of the headline items in an agenda. That happened at COP29 with the $300 billion climate finance goal and the attempt to try and get the carbon markets through Article 6 to be working where countries could trade carbon credits. How did COP16 end?
Well, it ended over a couple of days, which I think is the first point. We were reassured in the run-up that it's very unusual to go over time, and it ran over time and ended somewhat abruptly after a big success of signing off on a document explaining the ways to kind of operationalize this digital sequence information fund called the Cali fund. That was a big success, and you had a kind of sentiment that, momentum was good and things were going well. And then they came to the resource mobilization strategy, and after some welcoming comments from developing countries, developed nations stood up one after the other and just said, no, 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 no. At which point, I think Brazil intervened to ask if there was still quorum, because we were in the early hours of Saturday at that point and some people had started to leave to get their flights. So are there enough people in the room to make a decision? There weren't. And so the event ended abruptly and has been suspended and will be resumed next month in Rome, where they will iron out or try to iron out over 2 or 3 days, which seems rather short given the contentions, the outstanding agenda items.
So this is unusual and rare, but it's not unprecedented. COP meetings of this kind, not just in nature or climate, but also in other types of big UN bodies, tend do have this option of suspending the COP and then restarting it in another place. Was there a scene that you remember that sort of like captured how it feels? Because obviously they spent 2 weeks, they're all these people from different countries, they really want an outcome, and then they don't have it.
I think there were a few moments. One was a kind of emotive intervention from the Philippines talking about the urgency of what's being discussed when they were the countries were arguing over some details of texts. You know, he mentioned that they've lost already recently a couple of species of bird to typhoons, which again speaks to the interconnectivity of climate change and nature loss issues. So there was that emotive intervention, and then shortly after, an Australian negotiator had their heads in their arms, and Susanna Mohammed, the COP president, asked in plenary, Australia, are you still awake? And then you had a standing ovation when they signed off the digital sequence information on genetic resources text, and then suddenly this total collapse. And again, the moment that stuck in my mind after the kind of show of the whole event in Cali, there was a big opening ceremony, there was real kind of energy throughout the event. The president just walked off the stage and it ended. There was no closing speech, nothing. It just collapsed.
And Susanna Mohammed, the environment minister of Colombia, was the president of COP16. Well, she was also quite active at COP29, and it felt to me that having seen what happened at COP16, she felt this urge to make sure that that kind of failure doesn't happen again. And she partly succeeded at COP29, but we'll see what happens at the resumed COP and whether in Rome they come up with the items that haven't been agreed. So let's take the big one, which is where developed countries said no, no, no. What was that, and how do you resolve that?
Yeah, so the crux of the issue in Cali was around the creation of a new fund. So as part of the resource mobilization strategy, or the way to kind of collect developed country contributions, a fund was set up called the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, which is housed at the Global Environment Facility, which is based in Washington, D.C. It was officially launched last summer, August 2023. And developing countries basically see it as controlled by developed nations, and they want a new fund that's overseen by the COP, so the Conference of Parties, so much broader representation instead. And developed countries, on the other hand, say that we've already got the GBFF, let's just focus on making it better. A new fund doesn't mean more money, and they disagree, basically. So there was a bit of a curveball in the sense that on Friday morning, so the day that the event was meant to wrap up, this fund wasn't really on the table. It was going to be discussed at a later date. Then I believe it was in the early hours of Saturday morning, a new text got tabled and the fund was back in there. So the countries didn't really have time to go through the text, and the developing countries very much welcomed it when they got to that agenda item. But when it turned over to the developed nations, one after the other, Canada, Japan, the EU and others just said no, no, no. And I mean, an important point to highlight is that when the GBFF was formed, it was formed as a temporary stopgap solution to 2030. So from 2030, there is a question mark over where this money is going to be collected. And what was proposed in the text, it was the last version of the text, was that from 2030, a new fund overseen by the COP is set up. So I think it does speak a bit to the distrust that was in the room. Like, the developing nations, I think, were proposing a pragmatic solution that worked a little bit better from them in terms of representation, and it was just outright denied.
What do you think private markets can do to try and address this crisis? And how does it fit in with their business model, which is very clearly towards making money?
Well, I think the way in which it's broken down in the numbers in the text is quite a useful way of thinking about it. 500 billion needs to come from redirecting harmful subsidies. So you can think about that more broadly as limiting your impact on the planet and finding business models that are more sustainable. The flip side of that is about how to raise this additional 200 billion. And that's, of course, where private finance is focusing its attention. These are opportunities to make money out of the problem. And there was I mean, these COPs are not really the forum for that, but of course there's plenty of side events where the private sector can participate. And there were two products, as it were, that were really prominent, I would say, in Cali. One is biodiversity credits. So the kind of equivalent to a carbon credit, where carbon credits are about offsetting your emissions. There's a big debate in the biodiversity space about whether biodiversity credits are about offsetting your impacts on nature or whether they're about making a positive contribution to projects that help protect it. But nonetheless, these are tradable instruments that are very controversial and was a big part of the proceedings there, to the extent that rooms were overflowing. I think every single day there was a side event on biodiversity credits. A number of kind of guidance principles were launched to try to make sure the market doesn't fall down the same shortcomings as the carbon markets. At the same time, businesses were pitching their ways of measuring and trading nature. And the other one was debt for nature swaps, which are deals where countries can refinance their sovereign debt on better terms and allocate the savings to conservation projects. So this has been a model really spearheaded by the Nature Conservancy, a US nonprofit, and Credit Suisse, but is now, witnessing a lot of competition from big global banks that ultimately can make a lot of money out of the fees that they get from structuring these extremely complex and bespoke deals. And some are also offering loans now and, obviously making money out of the interest on those. So those are kind of the two products, I would say, that are really in the eyes of Wall Street when it comes to this issue.
And they're both new instruments. You and I have covered carbon credits for a while now, and to the extent where I actually am still very tired of covering them, but there is no way around covering them. Biodiversity credits, which you've covered also for some time, what are the pitfalls that are different from carbon, right? In carbon, the pitfall is you're supposed to actually offset for a ton of carbon, and you want to ideally have it one-to-one. So if you're extracting fossil fuel from the ground, then you want to have that carbon go back into the ground, and typically that doesn't happen. In biodiversity, how do you exactly do that? If you kill a bird that is extinct now, you can't offset that by bringing that bird back to life, right?
Yeah, so this offsetting credits debate is very contentious, and people feel strongly, as they do in the carbon space, about both sides of the argument. So on the one hand, if you think about it, we are going to continue destroying nature in the future. We build homes, we build infrastructure, we build mines to fuel the energy transition, and that destroys tracts of land and everything that lives on it. So there's a group of people that think that offsetting is fundamentally critical. You have to compensate for your impact, otherwise we're just going to have a downward spiral of loss. Obviously, there's a number of guardrails that can be put in place, and the people who back that generally, I think, promote, which is that it should be a regulated market with proper oversight. The offsetting should be done as local as possible and in as equivalent ecosystems as possible. So if you impact a wetland in Norfolk, you rebuild a wetland in Norfolk. I think people who think about this seriously don't really agree that a rainforest in Brazil can be offset with savanna in Kenya. The other side is that biodiversity offsetting is fundamentally flawed, and given the complexities of nature and the challenges with measuring it, and the fact that there are no single units like there are for carbon, there's no 1 ton of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas equivalent emissions like there is in nature, that this is never going to work. So that's the offsetting debate. And then so out of that really has emerged the credits. They sit in what's called the mitigation hierarchy at the very end. So, you impact nature, you minimize your impact on nature, you avoid your impact on nature, you minimize it, you restore it, you offset it, and then you invest in a biodiversity credit, and you are nature positive. Obviously ignoring the fact that you have to offset your nature to get to the zero to become positive. So it's a very kind of theoretical debate that once you then look at the buy side and the people who actually are going to be spending money on these instruments, whether there'll be any demand for credits rather than offsets, and what happened to the offsetting component if these are only credits. And it starts to kind of, I think, fall apart. But there's also an international market for these emerging. Companies are beginning to trade them globally. So you will get a company with, supply chains in one area of the world or in one country investing, in credits elsewhere. Obviously, I think the goal is to keep it as local as possible, but that's not how the market itself is being set up. And I think, as we've seen over and over again, once you create a market, it takes on a life of its own. And if it's outside of regulated frameworks, then anything goes, basically. And that's what we've seen in the carbon market. And I think that's the big risk for the biodiversity credits market, which is why there was such a focus on it in Cali.
And can you give me an example of what a biodiversity credit looks like? Because some are clearly selling already.
So England last year brought into force what's called biodiversity net gain, which is an offsetting mechanism. Infrastructure developers and home builders are required to compensate and find 10% on top, so 110% compensates for their impacts. And that means there's a number of developers across the country now that are taking over degraded land and restoring it and creating, the difference between the starting point and the restored point. They package as a credit and they sell it as an offset. So I went to visit last year a small field called Puddington Moor in Devon in the southwest of England, which was a field of pumpkins, I think, or swedes. It was a swede field. So it had been run by a farmer that was supplying supermarkets. It had been just pummeled with fertilizer and, over farmed really for decades. And so this young couple bought it. They took out a mortgage to buy it. They are going to restore it to the indigenous, what's called culm grasslands. The difference there between the starting point and the end point is what creates the biodiversity credits, which are sold to companies that operate within that area and need to compensate for their impacts. Another example, which is going to be pitched as a credit instead of an offset, I went to visit an estate in Yorkshire where, again, they've got a segment of land that's been destroyed by years of intensive agriculture, and they're going to restore it to what's mostly wetlands in that area. And they're marketing those credits to companies globally. So anyone who has an interest in nature, or perhaps as a part of their supply chain in the UK, or for some other reason wants to invest in these credits, they can buy these credits and claim to have made a nature positive investment.
After the break, what we can expect when COP16 resumes in Rome next week. And if you've been enjoying this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It helps other listeners find the show. As with all our reporting, Natasha, this seems to be a pretty messy place to be, and perhaps that's why our reporting is valuable. But coming back to COP, despite the sense that it is not the place that solves all problems, it does create the space for solutions. What is going to happen in Rome? And then what happens in COP17, which is supposed to be in Armenia next year?
Yeah, so in Rome, they're going to address the agenda items that were left unresolved. The big one there is the resource mobilization strategy, but they're also going to be discussing ways to monitor progress, because at the moment, that's not actually very clear about how they can monitor and report on progress against the global biodiversity framework targets. So on the resource mobilization point, I think the fund is still very much on the table. So that will be 3 days of intense negotiations around that item, which led to the collapse of Cali. So yeah, we'll see that. And then looking forward to COP17 in Armenia, the focus there is again going to be a review of progress towards the implementation of the global biodiversity framework.
Because all these countries that were supposed to bring a plan for biodiversity did not, and maybe they will between now and COP17.
I think the expectation is that more countries will come out with more national biodiversity action plans, and that they'll be more specific and developed. There's also targets within those, and what will hopefully be agreed in Rome is a way to monitor progress, and that will all be taken together in Armenia next year to assess progress more broadly.
This was fun, Natasha. Natasha does a lot of other coverage, so you should check out her stories, which we'll link in the show notes. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Zero. And now for the sound of the week. That's the sound of indigenous musicians back at the opening of COP16 in Cali. If you like this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Share this episode with a friend or with someone who is going to Rome for work. You can get in touch at zeropod@bloomberg.net. Zero's producer is Maithili Rao. Bloomberg's head of podcast is Sage Bauman, and head of talk is Brendan Noonan. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to Sharon Chen and Jessica Beck. I am Akshat Rathi, back soon.